Some cases stay open for so long, they start to feel less like an active investigation and more like a memory everyone's afraid to let go of. This is one of those cases, a woman who vanished at 22, a file that sat mostly untouched for over a decade.
And a single moment at a hardware store that finally broke it wide open. I'm Marshall, this is another case I closed, and this is how it happened.
Danielle Foster was 22 years old when she vanished on her walk home from a part-time job at a grocery store, a route she'd walked hundreds of times before. It was early evening, still light out, in a quiet residential area. Not the kind of place anyone expected something like this to happen. Her roommate reported her missing that same night when she didn't come home and didn't answer her phone. Patrol found nothing unusual along her usual route. No signs of a struggle. No witnesses who remembered seeing anything out of the ordinary. The case was mine from the very first week, and I worked it hard for the first several months, canvassing the neighborhood repeatedly, following up on every tip that came through the hotline, reviewing what limited camera footage existed in the area at the time. But as months turned into years without a single solid lead, the file moved, like so many others, into a slower, ongoing status. Not forgotten, just quieter. Danielle's family never stopped pushing. Her mother called our department every few months for over a decade, always polite, always just asking if there was anything new. There usually wasn't. That's one of the hardest parts of working a long-term missing persons case. Knowing a family is waiting on an answer you don't have. Every year or two, I'd pull the file back out, re-interview someone, recheck a lead that technology had caught up to. New facial recognition tools, updated DNA databases, expanded license plate reader networks. Each time, I hoped something new would surface. For 12 years, nothing did. I'll admit, there were points where I wondered if this was a case that would simply never close. One of those files that stays open on paper, but quietly becomes a cold case in practice. The break came from somewhere I never expected. A hardware store employee in a town nearly 300 miles away recognized a customer from a segment on a true crime podcast he'd listened to weeks earlier. A podcast that had covered Danielle's disappearance as part of an episode on long-term missing persons cases. He said the woman's mannerisms, a distinctive scar near her eyebrow the podcast had mentioned, and something about the way she avoided eye contact all lined up with what he remembered from the episode. He didn't approach her. Instead, he quietly noted the vehicle she left in and called it into local police, who forwarded the tip to our department, given the case number referenced. I remember getting that call and being cautious. After 12 years, I'd learned not to let hope get ahead of verification. Tips like this had come in before and led nowhere. But something about the specificity of this one, the scar in particular, made me take it seriously enough to act immediately. I coordinated with local police in that town to run the vehicle's plate discreetly, without approaching the property directly yet. It came back registered to a man named Raymond Pruitt, 51 years old, living at a rural property just outside the town, with no significant criminal record on file, which frankly made the situation harder to assess from the outside. I requested aerial and satellite imagery of the property, standard practice before any approach in a case with this level of uncertainty. The images showed a modest home with a separate structure toward the back of the property, a detail worth noting, but not, on its own, evidence of anything. I flew out personally rather than working it entirely through the local department, given how long I'd carried this case. Local investigators and I met to plan a welfare check, not a raid since we had no warrant yet, and no confirmation beyond a hardware store employee's memory of a podcast episode. We needed to see her and see the situation before doing anything further. We approached the property together, 2 local officers and myself, under the reasoning of a standard welfare check tied to the vehicle tip. Raymond Pruitt answered the door and was cooperative on the surface, saying only a family friend was staying with him. When the woman came to the door, I recognized her immediately, even after 12 years. The scar near her eyebrow was exactly as the tip described. I asked her directly, by name, if she was Danielle Foster. She hesitated for a long moment before nodding. She was, by every visible sign, physically present and able to speak with us, though clearly disoriented by the sudden change in her situation after so many years of isolation. We separated her from Pruitt immediately and requested additional support to properly and safely manage the situation, including victim services trained specifically for long-term captivity cases. In the weeks that followed, working closely with trained victim advocates and at a pace entirely led by what Danielle was comfortable sharing, she described being approached by Pruitt on her walk home 12 years earlier, forced into a vehicle, and taken to that rural property where she had been kept isolated from the outside world ever since. She said the isolation itself, being cut off from any contact with anyone beyond Pruitt for over a decade, was, in some ways, harder to describe than any single moment of the ordeal. She talked about losing track of how much time had passed, and about the specific fear that had kept her from ever attempting to leave or call attention to herself during the rare time she'd been allowed outside the property. Her account, corroborated by items recovered from the property and by Pruitt's own shifting statements once formally questioned, gave investigators what we needed to build a complete case. Danielle was reunited with her mother the same week she was found. Her mother later told me it was the first time in 12 years she'd allowed herself to fully believe her daughter might still be alive. Danielle has chosen, understandably, to keep most of her life private since then. She's working, slowly and at her own pace, with a long-term support team to rebuild the parts of her life that were taken from her. I check in occasionally, and every time, I'm reminded that a single hardware store employee remembering a podcast episode was the reason this case ever had an ending at all.
12 years is a long time to keep a case open, but it's proof that cold doesn't always mean closed forever. Sometimes it just means waiting for the right person in the right place to notice the right detail. I'm Marshall. That's another case closed. If you believe justice should always win, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next case.